In the last year, Story in the Public Square brought you scholars, journalists, novelists, movie makers, and more. Some of the stories they shared made us laugh, others caused us worry and even anger. All of them helped us understand public life in the United States today. Join us now as we take a look back at some of our favorite stories and storytellers from 2017. That's this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me, as always, is my friend and co-host from the Providence Journal, G. Wayne Miller.
Over 48 episodes in the previous 12 months, we've had the opportunity to talk about big issues facing the United States with remarkable storytellers and scholars. Every one of them has helped shine a light on important issues.
This week, we're going to take a look back at some of the best moments of 2017, starting with the 2017 Pell Center Prize winner, Daphne Matsutake, and her incredible documentary, 22 Minutes, about the refugee crisis on the waters between Turkey and Greece.
You and your sound person, your sounds took a bit of a risk doing this. I mean, you go out on this boat, you see the waves. This isn't like going out on some little placid lake where, you know, you're in America or Greece inland or whatever. This is a dangerous place. Were you aware of that danger going over there, and what do you think in the middle of it?
I was aware of it up to the extent that I could be without having been there in real life. So. No, what I had seen and what I had read was really undermining the reality of the situation. When I went there and saw what actually is going on, I remember looking up in the sky and thinking, where is everyone? Where are the helicopters? Where is the world? What is happening? Why is it just four small Greek Coast Guard boats and some volunteers here and nobody else? Where is the United States? Where is England? Where is Europe? Where is everyone?
Of course, America has its own experience with migrants. It's become part of the American story, something we talked about in November with Princeton University's Esther Shore.
I have a Google alert for huddled masses, right? And I get,
it's probably going off all the time.
It's going off well, I get them all at midnight, but every midnight I get
Shut your phone off at midnight.
5 or 6 citations from letters to the editors, from op-ed, you know, even people sometimes reporting on this brouhaha. But I think what the poem does is returns ethics to the immigration issue. And it has been wanting, certainly in the Trump administration. There is no pretense at loftiness or ideals or any sense that America has a mission with regard to immigrants. Bannon, as you've probably heard, says America wasn't built by immigrants, it was built by its citizens. Now, those are not mutually exclusive at all. America has been built by immigrants who became citizens because we have processes by which they can legally become citizens.
There are scholars who see in contemporary political rhetoric sinister forces long thought dead in American politics. Christopher Viles made that point to us in July.
I'm saying if you look at Trump on the campaign trail, particularly this last summer, he seems to have unconsciously stumbled and rediscovered a very old fascist rhetoric in the sense that he has all of these emotional triggers and emotional buzzwords, this rhetoric and this language that's around nation, race, violence, that's very hyper-masculine in character, and that is explicitly anti-democratic or implicitly anti-democratic and authoritarian.
In reality, 2017 saw a lot of ghosts return to the American story. And in September, we spoke with historian Julian Chambliss about Confederate Civil War memorials.
Well, when we talk about memory, we're talking about how we sort of personalize the historical narrative, right? So for millions of Southerners, their family and their experience in the war is a family narrative. But that doesn't necessarily cover the entirety of the political, economic, and social narrative that constitutes the history of the war. So you can hold tight to your family narrative, but to that family narrative define the historical narrative that historians and scholars argue about as they measure the different sides and different perspectives to create a kind of unified political, social, economic narrative of the transformation of the country. This is the difference between the two things. It's very difficult for us to use family often to define the public narrative, and especially in the sense of how we want to remember the war. Because remember, this is the war in the South of Northern aggression. Right. This is the war in the South of states' rights. As I often tell students, the states' rights to do what? And do you know what aggression means? Who shot first? So these are really important questions. How we choose to remember the war from the Southern perspective is incredibly important, but it was important in the context of justifying what they were doing in the context of creating Jim Crow segregation, which was a systematic stripping of political rights of African Americans and the suppression of the political opposition from the Democratic Party standpoint. So the dismantling of the Republican Party and making it a marginal party. So those are two important things that sort of define that process, and how people remember the past was a tool to that process. So much so that even as they were trying to do it, people talked about you're deliberately erasing the past to serve your political aims today.
The protests over the removal of Confederate Civil War statues last summer brought to the streets self-described white supremacists and Nazis. Tim Gray, the chairman of the World War II Foundation, reflected on those alarming events.
We thought we were done with Nazis.
Yeah.
And honestly, the group that celebrates the Nazis, probably whether they read Mein Kampf or not, I don't know. Whether they can read, I don't know. Whether they've ever watched a World War II documentary, the History Channel, I don't know. There's always going to be hate in the world, and it seems like the Nazis have always been the measuring stick since about 1933 when Hitler came into power. That is the measuring stick. You don't go beyond Nazis. And people have joked about it. You saw the soup Nazi and Jerry Seinfeld and Blues Brothers, Dan Aykroyd's character, says, I hate Illinois' Nazis, with the I just think it's the measuring stick. If you want to be evil, Nazi is where you go. And I would say most of these people who are giving the salute don't know anything about history.
What do you think, the generation of guys that you are profiling,
Yeah.
how do they respond to this?
These are the guys they fought 72 years ago, 73, 74 years ago. And I think they look at it as these young people who are doing this have absolutely no idea what they're doing and who they're celebrating. And I think the veterans I've talked to have said, we fought the real Nazis a long time ago to try and rid the world of this, and here it is again.
And Casey Michelle helped us understand the ties between white supremacists, American separatists, and an unexpected foreign source of inspiration, Russia.
What I've been focused on, my research and my work has been focused on, are actors, movements, groups extraneous to the Trump campaign, however still supportive of. So these are actors and movements on the far right, things like white nationalists and the alt-right, fundamentalist Christian movements, as well as separatist movements here in the U.S. that look to Russia, that look to actors in the Kremlin, and in certain instances find a mutual affection and mutual support for one another, with the Kremlin and Kremlin-linked actors providing either networking opportunities, conferences, support that they can for these actors and these movements to continue and to expand and to have a broader political impact here in the U.S.
And who are some of these actors and some of these groups, U.S. groups?
Sure. So some of these groups focused, I've done a lot of work as it pertains to white supremacists and white nationalists, individuals like Richard Spencer, Sam Dixon, Jared Taylor. For those who follow white nationalists here in the U.S., those are some of the more prominent individuals. Also people like Matthew Heimbach, who is an out-and-out white supremacist based here in the U.S., who again look to Russia as a model they would like like to see bring to bear here in the U.S., some of whom have already traveled to Russia for these conferences of like-minded Western white nationalists and white supremacists. So that's one area. You have fundamentalist Christians, those on the so-called religious right, who over the past few years, even over the past decade, have been traveling to Russia, building up links with those in Russia, some of whom are Kremlin officials, organizing again conferences to help pass and support anti-abortion or anti-gay legislation, and hopefully create models they can bring back to the U.S. And then there are these separatists as well, not necessarily of the far-right variant. They are all over the political spectrum. Some are far-right, some are far-left. Nonetheless, looking to Russia for support for their movements here in the U.S. to help fragment, fracture, break off their states, their territories from the U.S. In a reprise of what the Soviet Union went through back in 1991.
The challenges facing the West, according to Alina Polyakova, are political and require political leaders and political solutions.
There is, I think, an important role for political leaders to play here, to make the public aware of the threat posed by, this political warfare that not just Russia, but other states are waging against us. And Russia has been the most prominent in the news, but authoritarian regimes learn from each other.
Right.
And so there are no consequences for these kinds of actions. If our political leaders are not willing to say, the Russian government has interfered in our elections, and not only have they done that, they're undermining our democratic values by exploiting our open societies, by turning our virtues into vulnerabilities for them to exploit. And some practical answers to that, beyond that political leadership, is we have to reinvest in an independent media space, investigative journalism. I don't think we're living in a post-truth world.
This is a special edition of Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. An audio version of this program can be heard 3 times each weekend on SiriusXM's popular Politics of the United States. That's the POTUS channel, 124. We produce Story in the Public Square each week at Rhode Island PBS with a talented crew of real professionals. You can see their names at the credits at the end of each episode, but they are world class, and our gratitude to them is immense. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. If you want to catch up with me on Twitter, I'm at JMLudis.
And I'm Wayne Miller from the Providence Journal. You can reach me at GWayneMiller. This week, we're taking a look back at some of the best moments from Story in the Public Square in 2017, including this very important conversation about mental health in the United States.
I think what's made the difference really are narratives, stories. The fact that people are finally finding stories to which they can relate. These are stories that have been in their families for years and years but haven't been told. But when some of us start telling our stories, the stories of our families, people come out of the woodwork and say, that's my story too. And I think that's what's made the most significant difference, is people for the first time beginning to understand that the people who are homeless on the streets were those cute kids in first grade who began to show signs and symptoms of mental illnesses. That many of the people who are in our jails, prisons, and our homeless population, even those who have ended up with violent actions, either suicide or homicide for that matter, are people who exhibited signs and symptoms when they did of mental illnesses many years before that people ignored.
Paul Gianfrido shared his story with us, and so did Jeff Spar, who spoke eloquently about the need for empathy.
Stigma that surrounds mental health and mental illness, I think, is that last great social injustice that we haven't got our hands on, and I ask people all the time, people ask me all the time as I'm traveling and speaking, why haven't we made the kind of progress that we should? And, I don't want to say I'm controversial, only controversial, not to downgrade the incredible work that organizations like ours and so many others are making, but, who are we kidding? It should be like this, and we're here right now. And the truth of the matter is, we're going to have to, do things a little bit differently, to start. And, so I'm sorry, what I was going to say is that, so people ask all the time, why haven't we made that kind of progress? And my answer is always the same: invisible and misunderstood. How do you tackle something you can't see and you can't understand? And I think that's one of the challenges behind this, and educating people and getting them to understand empathetically.
We can't look back on 2017 without talking about the healthcare debate. Bob Hackey from Providence College talked to us about how the way we talk about healthcare warps the entire debate.
The challenge, I think, for us is the crisis rhetoric leads us to think about the problems we face as essentially acute problems, thinking about it in a medical analogy. A heart attack patient, you have immediate intervention, save the patient's life. I think most of the problems we face with the healthcare system are not like that. They're chronic conditions. Rising costs are an issue over time. We're not alone in that. The uninsured, again, a chronic problem because we have lots of people uninsured for different reasons. Medical malpractice, a similar thing. We have ongoing issues with quality. But these are issues that we're not necessarily going to find a cure for. We are trying to manage them. And so the rhetoric of crisis is ill-suited for that kind of day-to-day management of a problem. We need to build more attention for solving problems piece by piece, if you will. And in many cases, knowing that we're not going to find a magic bullet.
Of course, sometimes policy debates are really just political debates, as David Jones from Boston University reminded us.
When some of these Senate Republicans were asked, okay, what's your goal? Now you're in charge, you have this majority, you have the White House, what's your goal with health reform? They would say, well, to repeal Obamacare. And the reporter said, okay, but what's your goal? Is it reduce costs, increase access? What's the policy goal? And the answer was, our goal is to get to 50. Our goal is to repeal Obamacare. And it became clear, I think, that this was political solutions for political problems, not really policy solutions for policy problems.
And in so many different aspects of American life, racism continues to lurk. We asked Tricia Rose about structural racism last spring.
Structural racism is a description of chronic disparity in outcomes as well as policies and behaviors that produce significant disadvantages for people of color, particularly Black people. So to have structural racism, that means there are policies, attitudes, prejudices, a wide range of factors that contribute to the outcomes of disadvantage in a wide range of areas in society. So it isn't just personal behavior. So say there's an individual who has a prejudice. That's not structural racism. Structural racism is when there's significant housing discrimination that plays out, when there's mortgage lending discrimination, when there's police profiling, when there's implicit bias, when there's evaluation on jobs, when there's hiring discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. Present tense and past accumulation.
There are other important narratives in 2017 as well, including the way in which we talk about poverty in America.
I think the story that gets told today is pretty much the story we've been telling in a lot of ways since the Middle Ages, and that is that if you are poor, it is through your own doing. And we've seen a couple of recent examples of this. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Ben Carson not long ago suggested that people are poor because they don't have the right mindset, and that if they would simply sort of will themselves, if they would think more positively and exert themselves, if they would expend effort in order to lift themselves from poverty, that they have the power, that they have the ability to do that themselves. A little bit before that, Representative Chaffetz from Utah suggested when talking about the then version of the Republican health reform bill that was going to radically increase costs for lots and lots of people, suggested that if simply people would refrain from buying a new iPhone, that then they would be able to afford health care. And at some level, I give him the benefit of the doubt. I think that he believes that. I think that at some level there are an awful lot of people in power who really do believe this long-standing story of poverty as moral failure, as an act of irresponsibility that manifests itself in your economic state.
Crime is another narrative that was important in the last 12 months. We talked with Eve Ewing from the University of Chicago about crime in her hometown.
I've given a lot of thought to that, and the thing that frightens me about that rhetoric is that, unlike much of his rhetoric, that idea that Chicago needs federal intervention and what really is lying underneath that suggestion has been in play for several years, including from people within the city. And my concern with it is that people who do not themselves actually live under the terror of day-to-day gun violence and fear and trauma, they have a well-meaning intention of saying, well, we need to solve that problem somehow, but they don't have any empathy for people who have these experiences or an understanding of the social roots of those problems. So right now we've had a lot of journalists and cultural critics astutely point out that the way we talk about, for example, the opioid epidemic in the contemporary moment is very different than how we talked about drug abuse and addiction, right, 10 or 20 years ago when the people under the media lens were primarily black people. And I think that there's a similar issue with violence, which is that we see mass shootings primarily perpetrated by white men across this country every single day that are terrifying and frightening and awful. But when we talk about those, we see them and say, you know, where do these political ideologies come from? What can we do to prevent these things structurally? And I think that's the same conversation we need to be talking about when it comes to gun violence. Understanding that people pick up guns at the end of a long line of really terrible structural problems that if we don't invest ourselves in addressing addiction issues, employment issues, educational issues, access to housing, all of those things, then we're trying to treat the sneeze and not the virus. And I think that that's really mistaken.
The reality, Mark Smerling of the podcast Crime Town reminded us, is that America has a problem with crime.
I think that America's got a very unfortunate relationship with crime. We glamorize it, and we love it at some level, but we do not have a way of dealing with it that is, I think, progressive. You know, particularly when it comes to criminals. And obviously, I am dealing with a lot of criminals. I mean, since I've always done crime, since capturing the Freedmans, and people who are out of prison. They, you know, it's very difficult for them to find jobs, almost impossible. There's no rehabilitation. There's no such thing. Our prison system is, in my opinion, bankrupt. It's not designed in any way to make life better for anybody. It's just completely punitive. So when people get out, it's not surprising that they return to crime, or they're dysfunctional and they become wards of the state. We're not doing a very good job dealing with our crime.
And over the course of the year, we talked to talented storytellers in a variety of media about war, memoirists like Tara Kopp.
My own experience in Iraq, I came back really kind of with a sense of shame because I ended up getting together with one of the soldiers that I covered after a fairly intense experience on the battlefield. And when I looked in my grandfather's memoirs, he had done the exact same thing. And so instead of seeing this like narrative of, and we dived on this target and saved a village, he goes at length to describe the women that he slept with. And to me, my cheeks just turned crimson. One, I thought, all right, the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. And two, I thought, well, this isn't the war hero I was looking for. When I went to Iraq, I was like, well, my grandfather served, and we can probably all thank Hollywood for the ideals we have in our head about the greatest generation. And yes, they did amazing things and they made unbelievable sacrifices, but they were still human and they made mistakes right and left, and they were unfaithful, and they got broke or they got drunk, like as my grandfather did. They're humans, but that didn't make their war story any less important.
War crimes investigators like Alan Ryan.
I start my class at Harvard and Boston College Law School by saying, if you think law of war is an oxymoron, you're probably right. How can you bring law and apply it to the lethal act of killing people? And the answer that we develop over the course of time is that you have to look at the law of war as being really the beginning of human rights law, because what it says is, even though my army is fighting your army and I am trying to kill your soldiers and you're trying to kill mine, still there are things that we will not do. We will not attack civilians, we will not torture, we will not shoot the wounded, we will not attack hospitals. And when you look at it as a way that serves the interest of both sides, that hospitals should be spared, civilians should be spared, towns that are not defended should be spared, it does bring a certain benefit to both sides.
And documentary filmmakers like Narges Bajali, who remind us that the costs of war don't end when the shooting stops.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest lesson that I hoped was that war just doesn't disappear when the ceasefires are signed and when the journalists leave the location. That actually, that's when a lot of times the hard work really starts, of a society rebuilding itself, of survivors of not just chemical weapons, but conventional weapons too, have to rebuild their lives. That was sort of my biggest, I wanted people, because it's so easy to forget. And I wanted people to sort of think about that here we are telling a story of a man who was exposed to chemical weapons almost 25, 26 years ago, and he's had over 50 surgeries on his eyes, his lungs are collapsing.
Storytelling, the heartbeat of this show, is central to the human experience, a point novelist Eric Bennett made last spring.
Books are only made of words, and any book you read endows you with the experience that those words communicate. And if it communicates that experience successfully, then it's a successful book. And part of my aversion to the autobiographical emphasis is it takes away the idea that within the library, within the archive, we're free to roam across the centuries and all spheres of human experience.
These are big issues, and they are the fabric of our democratic society, something under stress, as Michael Kennedy reminded us.
The stories that we used to tell about ourselves and about one another are changing in a pretty dramatic way. They're changing, above all, because of the ways in which the consensus that once defined, one might say, a democratic modernity, that somehow we're all about liberty, equality, and fraternity, or I would rather say freedom, justice, and solidarity. That holy trinity, if you can say that holy trinity is being frayed. It was being frayed originally by the character of globalization that overwhelmed us since the early 90s. But even more today, you can see that the kind of globalization that's affecting us is making people feel justifiably that they're losing control over their lives. And so one of the things that we're seeing across the world, and of course President Trump is a great illustration of this, is that he's trying to create a narrative in which we feel like we have control again. But I'm worried about that narrative, because that narrative is dependent upon a kind of showmanship that is actually deceiving the public from the character of the challenges that are actually facing us.
That's all the time we have this week and this year. But we want to thank you for joining us throughout 2017, for helping us to better understand how stories shape American politics, and for sharing our passion for civics and democracy.
If you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, or you can visit pellcenter.org, where you can also catch up on full previous episodes. I'm Wayne.
And I'm Jim. We'll be back again next week with a brand new episode of Story in the Public Square.